love to see such a crowded room this early in Washington. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name's Anna Palmer. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of Punchbowl News. We appreciate the full room in person and all of those of you who are joining us on the live stream as well. I am thrilled that we are kicking off this event, Women Challenging Washington. As you all know, you're in this room, that when women get together, things get done. I'm going to first give a big thank you to The Network, a new group focused on bipartisan cooperation and evidence-based solutions, for partnering with us on this event, as well as the LBJ Women's Campaign School. We have a great morning planned for you. We are doing a couple of different panels. We have Senators Joni Ernst, the Republican from Iowa, Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire, the Democrat. We also are going to hear from Arnold Ventures co-founder Laura Arnold about all of the philanthropy and amazing things that she and her husband are doing, as well as a look at rising stars in the House. We have Lisa Blunt Rochester, we have Mikey Sherrill, we also have Stephanie Bice, who are going to come on later this morning. I hope many of you have taken advantage of the headshots that we are doing in the back, the networking. A lot of what we talk about here is we want to be women lifting up women, and we hope that you are going to meet some new folks today as well, as you think about what you want to do in Washington, whether that's run for office, you want to work on a campaign, or up on Capitol Hill. So just a quick reminder that we'd love for you to share about today's event on social media. We want to bring this to the masses. You can find Punchbowl News at Punchbowl News on all social media platforms. You can also hashtag Punchbowl News so we can find it as well. Let's talk about this first panel. I am thrilled to kick off today's Women Challenging Washington event with Senators Ernst and Shaheen. They are both trailblazers. Senator Ernst, the first woman from Iowa to be elected to the Senate, also the first woman combat veteran to be in the Senate. We also have Senator Shaheen, first woman governor from the state of New Hampshire, first woman senator. They have been trailblazing for a long time. We're going to talk about their efforts to work together across party lines to get things done. So with that, I'd like to welcome the senators to the stage. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining me. It is a busy week in Washington, and as we start all of our conversations at Punchbowl News, we start with the news. This is going to be a very busy day. We have the big four leaders going to the White House to see President Joe Biden, talking about the debt limit. We are weeks away from reaching that. I want to get a sense from both of you. First, Senator Ernst, do you think it's time for Mitch McConnell to get engaged? You guys have kind of, as Republicans, let the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, really lead on the negotiations so far.
Well, this is an issue that we have been talking about for a number of weeks now, and Leader McConnell has indicated to the press as well that he will continue to support Kevin McCarthy's efforts. We're the minority party in the Senate, so he feels it's important that Speaker McCarthy have the opportunity to work with President Biden on this issue, and we'll support how we can then.
I'll turn it over to you then, because that sounds like we're going with Kevin McCarthy for now, for Republicans. But I would love to get your sense, Senator Shaheen, you've been through this before. We've been through debt limits, we've been through government spending, some of these thorny issues that become very partisan. Democrats so far have continued to insist on a clean debt limit, raising it in a clean way. Should President Biden be willing to negotiate?
I'm very troubled that only 25% of the people in the country understand the ramifications of a default by the U.S. government. It will not only affect people's 401ks and pension plans, it will affect anybody who's dependent on the government, veterans, people on Social Security. It affects how much people have to pay for mortgages and car loans. And ultimately, it has the potential to undermine the dollar as the basis of the global economy. So this is not something that we should have political gamesmanship about. I believe we should no longer have Congress involved in raising the debt limit. We're really the only industrialized country that does that. I think it's time to say this is not a place where we ought to be playing partisan games. So I think we can negotiate around spending, and I think we should always do that when it comes to a budget, but we should not be arguing about whether to raise the debt ceiling, because we've already incurred these expenses, we need to pay for them, and we need to send the message to the rest of the world that we're going to do that.
Well, you talk about this being such a crucial issue, right? I mean, massive, massive ramifications if we do default. How worried are you that we are going to default? Do you feel like it's going to be that kind of the Washington special sauce where it's a last minute deal that comes together, or are you really concerned? I would go to both of you on that question.
I don't feel that we will hit that point. I think it is important, just as Senator Shaheen laid out, it is so important that we do raise the debt ceiling, but we have to understand that our country is over $31 trillion in debt. We've seen unprecedented levels of spending in recent years, and we need to get beyond that. We do need to put controls in place for our level of spending. We are spending so much money as a federal government, it is causing inflation. And our families, whether it's New Hampshire, Iowa, California, you name it, our families are unable to meet most of their basic needs at this point because of inflation. So we've got to take a step back. And I do hope that President Biden lives up to the promise that he made on day one of his presidency, that he would be the president that would bring the parties together, work together. And I'm hoping that he sticks by that and comes to the table today with Speaker McCarthy and works through this issue. It's so important.
Well, I think Joni and I and most of us can agree we need to do something about this country's debt, and it's past time to do that. I worked on an effort when I first got to the Senate back in 2009 with the Obama administration that would have made a significant, set us up on a road that would have paid down the debt. But the issue right now is, how are we going to deal with the current default? I was here in 2011 when we got very close to defaulting. Our bond rating got downgraded, people's costs went up. It took us 5 years to recover in terms of programs and private businesses, the defense industry who depend on federal spending. So I think we should not be having this debate. We need to resolve this and have the debate over how we're going to pay down our debt, but it should not be part of the debt ceiling.
I want to talk about one other quick issue before we get kind of into the topic of the day, which is gun legislation. This is one area where we did see bipartisan support last year with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This law, for those who aren't familiar with it, expanded background check requirements for people under 21, established new offenses for firearm tracking, extended restrictions to individuals convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors, among other things. It seems as if almost every week we are having another tragedy in this country where there is a mass shooting, Allen, Texas being the most recent. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is planning on holding an internal meeting of Senate Democrats following the most recent shooting. There's little chance, I think, that anything happens. I would love for your sense of what else needs to happen. Are you supportive of any kind of package moving through before the end of the year? Because it seems as if, I think when you talk to folks where I'm from or across the country, there's just such frustration right now about what's happening.
Yes, and the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was an important step forward, and I was supportive of that bill and voted for it. And I think it was great work focusing on mental health, making sure that resources got into schools for those school districts, and again, fully supportive of that. Iowa so far has been able to take advantage of a number of the resources that we were able to provide in that package. Roughly about $10 million has already gone into Iowa. I think we do need to continue to focus on mental health and resilience. Our population is not as resilient as maybe when I was growing up. I just didn't think about, getting angry at someone and committing the types of atrocities that we are seeing today. So focusing on mental health is extremely important. And again, I think the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was an absolute solid step forward and something that we could come together on.
It was an important step, the first gun safety legislation in over 30 years, and mental health is clearly a continuing issue. But we have too many guns in this country. And we've equated support for the Second Amendment with the inability to do anything about those guns that are in the hands of those people who shouldn't have them. And we've got to start focusing on that. After Newtown, I voted to ban assault weapons. I voted to limit the size of magazines. I voted for comprehensive background checks. All of those things we know would make a difference in terms of dealing with the gun violence that we have in this country. New Hampshire is a very strong Second Amendment state, and people understand that with guns come responsibility, and it's not an either or kind of situation. We've got to do something about this gun violence.
All right, let's talk about women challenging Washington. You both, in the intro, I mentioned trailblazers in your own states, leaders as women, a lot of firsts. Would love to get a sense from you, you've been in politics for a long time at this point. What was that like when you were kind of coming to the Senate, first woman from Iowa being elected in the Senate, a combat veteran? What did you bring to Washington? I think we often talk about, and you look at the stats, right? Mm-hmm. Women get things done, especially when they partner together. I'll start with you, Senator Ernst. Why is that? What's the special sauce?
Well, I don't know exactly what that special sauce is, because I think that women bring so many different talents, skills, and abilities from their perspective into whether it's Washington, D.C., or your state capitals. And for me, it was just taking on that challenge of the unknown. I did not come from a politically connected family. I grew up on a very small farm in southwest Iowa, very, very rural area. And so for me to move forward, it was, again, that unknown. But having the leadership, I think large in part that came from serving in the military, I think it was a challenge I wanted to take on. And I wanted to have that seat at the table when discussions were made about whether it was agriculture, whether it was armed services. I felt that it was important to take a strong voice there. I've been through many of those glass ceiling types of episodes through my life, where I was the first female company commander of my unit in the Iowa Army National Guard. I was the first female battalion commander of my battalion in the Iowa Army National Guard. So, stepping forward as a female, it wasn't necessarily about gender for me. It was just more of taking on those challenges, wrapping my arms around those leadership opportunities, and having a voice at the table.
You also, a trailblazer, right? Governor, first woman governor of the state, first woman senator. How have you found things, how have you tried to lead when it comes to kind of being a woman in Washington?
Well, as Joni says, women's experiences aren't necessarily better or worse than men's, but they are different. Mm-hmm. And it's important to have women's voices at the table, whether it's in the corporate boardroom or the town meeting. And I have always approached elective office as an opportunity to talk about what mattered to my constituents, to the people of New Hampshire, and not to talk about it from the perspective of being a woman. And I think people have accepted that. I always felt like I didn't have to tell people I was a woman. That was obvious. You could tell when you looked at me, you could tell when you listened to me. And so it didn't have to talk about that. But talking about issues that matter to my constituents from my perspective as a woman is what I think has been important. And as we've looked at some of the crisis points in the Senate, I think Joni would agree with me, it's women who have often taken the lead in some of the government shutdowns. It was the women who got together to say, we need to find a way to solve this. And I think, women often are less concerned about who gets credit for things. We're often, if we look at corporations, it used to be that we had sort of a paternal organization of corporations, a paternal approach to decision making. And now that's really changed in most corporations. It's much more a maternal approach, engagement, bringing everybody in, having everybody have a voice. And I think that's how women often approach decision making in a way that makes it more likely we can compromise.
I mean, think about that, right? We're having the debt limit conversation right now. We're just about to come up on government funding. Right. Do you think women are going to be the linchpin here once again, potentially in the Senate, to try to find a way forward?
Look, I think it's really exciting that we now have 4 women head of the appropriations committees in the House and Senate. And Susan Collins, who is the vice chair, and Patty Murray, who is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, have said very clearly, we are going to get back to regular order. We are going to get this process done. We're moving on a schedule to do that. They are working with the women leaders in the House, and I think that's very positive. And so hopefully we can all look at that as a model for how we can deal with the current crisis around the potential to default in this country.
All right, I want to talk about some of the things that you all have been leading on. You have a track record of working across the aisle with women when it comes to tackling some of the thorniest issues in Congress. Let's talk about some of them. I want to talk about, in particular, I think that what came into focus was the support that you both have when it comes to Afghan women. Kind of take outside of the politics of the pullout and some of the criticism that has happened kind of after that or in the lead up to that. But would love for you all to talk about, why is that so important? What have you been doing when it comes to that?
Well, it is incredibly important, and Senator Shaheen and I have worked very closely together on this issue. After the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, we saw the Taliban go back in, even going against their assurances with this administration that they would allow girls to continue to attend school, that they would continue to allow women to hold jobs and have a place in society. And we all saw that crumbling away. So Senator Shaheen and I led a letter to the president and the administration, really pushing them to engage in this discussion, because we really wanted those advances that the women had seen over the past 20 years in Afghanistan to continue. And remarkably, with that letter, we had every single female senator sign on to it, Democrat and Republican. And there have been a number of other issues that we've worked on together. And Jean, I think it was you led the trip up to the UN. And we held a discussion at the UN with a number of women senators and representatives there over this very issue. It's not just Afghanistan. As we look around the world, in Iran as well, you've seen the protests on TV. We just need to be very supportive of women and their right to speak out around the globe. I've been sanctioned now by the Iranians. I'm sure maybe you have too, Jean, but because, and why not? It's, a feather in our cap just because we are out there and supporting women, and it's important, regardless of what party you're in. It's very important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, that's worth clapping about. Yeah, those sanctions go with our denial by Vladimir Putin to give me a visa to Russia too. So
Yes.
I appreciate
Russia
that.
too.
But you're absolutely right. I remember meeting virtually with a number of Afghan women leaders in the spring before the pullout, and I would say there are differences of opinion about our pullout of Afghanistan, but Senator Ernst and I were very much on the same page in opposition to that. But what I remember about that conversation with those women leaders was I said, what can we do to support you after this pullout? And they said, keep talking, because we're listening to what you say in the United States. And if you continue to talk about how important this is, we're going to hear that, and it gives us hope that at some point things are going to be different. So it's really important for us to speak out. And it's not just about women's empowerment. That's critical, as Joni says. but it's also good foreign policy. And it's good for global stability, because what we know about societies where women are empowered is they're likely to be more stable. I serve on the Foreign Relations Committee, so we talk about this a lot. Because women give back more to their families and their communities than men do. Sorry, all you men in the room. But women contribute 90% of what they earn back to community and family. Men only contribute about 35%. And we know that those societies are more likely to be able to support democracy. So this is not just good in terms of what I believe is morally right, but it's good foreign policy.
I'm going to shift gears. Permitting reform. Another area, energy exploration, is one of those big efforts that failed last year. There are Republicans and Democrats, and now even some unions that are supportive of trying to find a way forward when you look at just how long it takes to get some of these projects underway, largely often because of some of the permitting hurdles. Is this one area where you think women might lead? We saw, your colleague, Shelley Moore Capito, Republican from West Virginia, come forward with kind of her proposal. Obviously, Senator Manchin had a different proposal. What's the latest there? Could you see that happen? It seems like that, to me, is something where President Joe Biden might say in a presidential year would be a good opportunity.
I am fully supportive of Shelley's effort. Senator Capito has a bill that she introduced just a few days ago with Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming, and it is permitting reform. And we really do have to come together on this issue. So while we may differ on types of energy and how much energy we should be using, I think we all agree that domestic energy is better. Both in the renewable space and maybe more of those fossil fuels out there. We have to find that right balance. But bottom line is that if you aren't able to expand the grid and build those lines and connectivity, you can't get it done unless you have permitting reform. Yeah. So very supportive of those efforts, but I do think this is a great area where women can come together and make that happen.
Me too. As governor, I permitted 2 gas pipelines across New Hampshire without any real opposition at the local level because we engaged folks. And so this is a place where I think it's in everybody's interest to figure out how we make this happen.
Mm-hmm. One other topic, and then we're quickly getting the hook here. So I'm going to have kind of a little bit of a speed round because there's some other things I do want to talk about. But I want to talk about China. That is also, I think, one of the kind of areas where we could have had an entire conversation about. Yeah, but it is one of those areas where you see certainly bipartisanship in terms of, Mr. Schumer has come forward kind of with a larger, robust package. A lot of Republicans want to take on whether it's TikTok or other organizations. Is that one of the things that we should be watching, we should be tracking, where there could be some movement here?
Oh, I definitely think so. This is such a huge issue, and we really want the American public to know and understand the overall threat that China does pose with national security, the economy. We know that they are a significant trade partner, but we also need to be wary of China. So we've come together. Chuck Schumer has said that he would have a China bill, but we also need to focus on other areas like our National Defense Authorization Act, and all of us will have different measures dealing with China. One issue I'm working on both in the NDAA and through the Farm Bill is China's ownership of ag land. They are purchasing land across the United States. This is a big issue. And while states like Iowa do have a few measures in place, we need to focus across the nation on these issues. So yes, it is important, and it is something that we need to keep our eye on.
Without a doubt, and I think it's important to recognize that our fight is not against the Chinese people, it's against the Communist Party that governs China, and so the PRC. And I think one of the things that's really important right now, and we haven't talked about Ukraine at all, the war in Ukraine, but one of the important reasons why we need to continue to support the Ukrainians and defeat Vladimir Putin is because our other competitors and aggressors are watching very closely what we do there. And you can bet she is looking at what happens in Ukraine to make a determination about what he's going to do in the about Taiwan in the future. We know that Iran and North Korea are watching very closely. So this is something that we need to keep the American people supportive and behind. As one group of Ukrainian women in the military said to me last fall, they said, "You need to give us the weapons so that we can fight Russia so that you don't have to." And so I think there is a lot of bipartisan support to look at how we address the PRC going forward, both economically and militarily.
Before I let you go, I want to ask another trailblazing woman, Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, has had some health issues, has not been here. Some of your colleagues have said it's time for her to resign. Where do you stand on that?
I really appreciate Dianne, and I think that is such a personal decision. So it's not up to Senator Joni Ernst to make that decision for her or to speak out about it. Dianne, I would say, is one of my strongest partners from the Democratic women, Gina aside, because we've worked on so many issues. But one of our significant achievements was the Violence Against Women Act. Dianne and I worked for years to reauthorize that act. And I have such an incredible respect for her that I just am going to stay silent on the issue. It is a personal decision.
I agree. And Anna, you know, I was here in the final days of Senator Byrd. I was here in the final days of Senator Cochran. And I didn't hear a lot of people saying they need to resign because they have these health issues. So I think there's some gender bias going on here. That is really unfortunate, and I hope that Dianne Feinstein is back very soon. She has had a storied career and has done so many good things for so many people, and she needs to make her own decisions about this.
All right, last question, and we always love in these conversations to end on a really optimistic note. We have so many women here who are thinking about their future in politics, wanting to get involved. What is one piece of advice that you would give your younger self that you know now and that you want to share with this audience?
I guess the piece of advice that I leave young women with is when they ask me about it is be that subject matter expert. Whatever your passion is, be the expert on that passion. And when you walk into a room, own that room. You own it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I have experienced so many times through my life when I was the only female walking in to give a briefing of a general, the only female in the room. But I always made sure that I was well rehearsed, I was the subject matter expert, and that general or whoever I was briefing would leave that briefing with no doubt that young Captain Ernst or Lieutenant Colonel Ernst was the absolute best, regardless of gender. Own the room, ladies.
I love that. That's great.
You know, I remember right after my third child was born, some people in New Hampshire came to me and said, "Why don't you run for Congress?" And I really thought about it. But then I thought about the fact that I had this new baby. I had 3 children at that point. My husband was not supportive. And I came to realize that we have a lot of time in our lives, and that don't feel like you have to do everything all at once. You know, there's time to have a family if you want to do that. There's time to be a career woman if you want to do that. There's time to run for political office if you want to do that. So think about it as an opportunity throughout your lifetime to take advantage of whatever comes up that you want to do.
All right, we're going to close there. Thank you, Senator, so much for your time
Thank you,
this morning.
Howard. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, let's do this way. All right, what a great conversation. I could have spent another 30 minutes. I had so many more questions to get to. But when we were talking about women challenging Washington, Our next conversation is going to feature someone who is certainly at the top of that list. Laura Arnold has been a graduate of Harvard, Cambridge's master's program, and Yale Law School. She also clerked at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and worked at one of the world's most powerful law firms before going in-house to work at a major energy company in Houston, where she met her husband, John. Together, they became some of the country's youngest billionaires. But instead of running for president or retiring to a private island, they decided to do something different: give their money away. They started Arnold Ventures, a philanthropy, research, and advocacy organization. If you see a major piece of bipartisan legislation, the odds are very good that the Arnolds were supporting the effort to bring it to fruition, be that education, criminal justice reform, or healthcare. Laura Arnold is here with us today to be interviewed by the leader of one of her grantees, Amy Kroll, the executive director of the University of Texas Austin's Lyndon B. Johnson Women's Campaign School, which trains women to run for office or manage campaigns regardless of their political affiliation. I want to welcome Amy and Laura to the stage. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Laura, for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. Thank you all for being here.
So today we are talking about women challenging Washington, and in your role as the head of a major philanthropy, research, and advocacy organization, you are somebody who's on the front lines of challenging Beltway status quo, and you have already had a huge impact. You were recently named by the Chronicle of Philanthropy in one of the top 3 philanthropists in the nation. And much of that work has focused on public policy, like Anna mentioned. So my first question to you is, why are women uniquely poised to work in the political arena?
Well, thank you for that question. And again, it's an honor to be here. Why are women uniquely positioned? I think that if you have a goal, as we do, I think as we all do, to maximize opportunity, minimize injustice, to create a better world for our children than the world in which we currently exist, you have to approach policymaking with respect for different vantage points. And unfortunately, although this is changing, and I think much of the reason why many of us are here is that women are not represented adequately in policymaking roles, whether that's the legislature. We just heard from 2 very prominent senators who are part of, what is it, maybe 30% of women in the Senate. It doesn't reflect the population. The numbers are similar in the House, and the numbers are similar in any sort of across the board when you look at any decision-making entity, whether it's a corporate entity or a government entity. We see that the perspectives of women, the perspectives of racial minorities, the perspectives of ethnic minorities are not as adequately represented as they should be. And and what happens, obviously, then, is that we're only as good as our own experience, right? And I mean, we can consult with people who have different perspectives and different backgrounds, but we don't have the same lived experience. I think the most relevant recent example is the midterm election in 22, when we saw people voting, when we saw women voting in a way that expressed a viewpoint on abortion that was not the viewpoint that that was predominant in some legislative bodies. And so there's a disconnect that I think is reflected by the fact that representation is not where it needs to be.
And it's that respect for different vantage points that I think makes you really unique as a philanthropist. You are somebody who cares a lot about bipartisan work, like you mentioned. And so today's Senate and congressional panels, they are both highlighting their bipartisan work. And you're somebody who has been funding groups from across the political spectrum, which I think is very unique. Not every major funder takes that route. So why is it so important to you to move policy forward in a bipartisan way?
Well, we like to think of our work as truly nonpartisan. So we have a view, we have a theory of change. We have a belief that a certain system is broken. We believe we have a window of opportunity to make changes because we believe we have a better alternative that either has been proven or that we'd like to test. But we can't do that. You know, if we look at the viewpoint distribution in our country, most of us are pretty much in the middle, right? I mean, there isn't this polarization in the population that we see in our legislative bodies. So we can't support something, however well-intentioned and however smart, if only a certain part of the political spectrum supports that idea. Because then what happens? That whenever that part of the political spectrum is out of office, that thing gets voted away, right? It's not sustainable. We deeply believe that sustainable change comes from the center. And that's why we fund centrist politicians. That's why we fund centrist ideas. And that's why we fund efforts that are centrist in nature, nonpartisan in nature, but that might resonate with people who might be on, you know, one side or the other of the spectrum. Because we truly believe that that's how you achieve sustainable change.
And that focus on sustainable change, I think, is so important. And today, we have, like Anna mentioned, we have so many women in the audience today from the LBJ Women's Campaign School. These are women who want to run for office. They want to manage campaigns. We also have a lot of women in Texas watching the live stream today. Yes. And so these women, they have big ideas for what they want to do in their community, the change that they want to see in their community. And so what advice would you have for them on what issues they should be focusing on when thinking about some of those things you talked about, like sustainable change and really moving the needle on some of the issues they care about the most?
Well, I think, I mean, obviously their exercise, the exercise of the women who are thankfully seeking office and preparing for a career in political life is actually very different from my job. You know, my job, I like to think that my job is to identify systemic dysfunction, understand whether or not we can elaborate and think about creative solutions, test those solutions, and implement those into policy. And I have a set of resources available to me, not just monetary resources, but much more importantly, the enormous talent in Arnold Ventures, both expertise and advocacy talent. And some of you may have met some of our amazing team members who are in the room. So I come at it from sort of an outsider's perspective, outsider looking in. I think that by way of advice to people who are thinking about entering the political fray, I do think people value reasonableness. I think that the current political system this is one of our issue areas, by the way, is incentivized to for candidates to gravitate toward the extremes because the primary system is hyperpartisan and the primary system rewards this extremism, which is how you get elected officials who don't necessarily reflect the values or the opinions of the people they represent. Somebody has to break that cycle. We have to start thinking about creating better alternatives for voters. And it's on us as voters now to value that approach, as opposed to voting only on a party basis, even if it's somebody who we don't necessarily like. So I think going back to your question in terms of what advice I would give, I think first and foremost is to value the fact that, you know, righteousness can be a flaw. You can't be so extremist in your view that you are unwilling to admit that the other side is a little bit right. Not entirely right, but just a little bit right. Nobody's entirely right. And if you don't validate the other side, in my mind, you lose credibility. Now, that doesn't mean the political system doesn't reward that currently, but we are working on that. And I think we need everybody in this room and everybody in this country to value honest conversation and compromise.
Yes. Thank you so much. love that focus on honest conversations, listening to one another. That's something that I really emphasize to the women in our program. I emphasize it right off the bat, but also I'll tell you a quick story, which is that last year, right after the Dobbs decision was announced and right after the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, we had a class, and those two things had just happened. And I thought, what am I going to do walking into this bipartisan space? People have very different, very passionate views about this issue. And I reminded the women that being bipartisan does not mean being silent. It means bringing everything with you that encouraged you to be in public life, but then also listening to one another and having conversations with one another.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think and look, some examples are heartbreaking. The Dobbs decision, for many of us, was heartbreaking. The reality of the Dobbs decision, especially when you live in a state like Texas, is painful and heartbreaking every day. Now, one could become a militant for women's rights, and I hope we all are, but that should not exclude you from thinking about where you can move the needle. So in this example specifically, at least my approach has been, okay, I am not going to convince an anti-abortion activist that abortion isn't whatever, fill in the blank, whatever they believe that is. But maybe we can have a conversation about the fact that nobody wants abortions to happen in the first place. So nobody wants unwanted pregnancies to happen in the first place. Can we not collaborate, as we've done in Utah, as we've done in Oklahoma, as we've done in many, many red states? Can we not collaborate on contraception, on contraceptive choice and access, on minimizing the probability or possibility that people who are not in a position or don't desire to get pregnant? Can we not work on that? I mean, that has nothing to do with abortion. Now, there are some, I think I would call them sort of ideologically extreme people who believe the contraceptives are also, some contraceptives are abort efficient. So that's not a real thing. That's not a thing. That's not a, that is, basic biology can prove that that's not a thing. So we are hopeful that very, very small extremist contingent can, that we can have conversations around that. But even on an issue as divisive as abortion, and as painful and as heart-wrenching, and as emotional for many of us as abortion, because there is, in the minds of many of us, a right and a wrong here, right? There is an important objective of valuing women's rights. There's an argument that that's a constitutional right of women to privacy in their own bodies. So I accept that and I embrace that. But at the same time, we have to face the reality that there are people who don't agree with us. So there are channels of work for us that can help women and that can prevent pregnancies from happening in the first place. And that doesn't detract from our passion and our mission on the bigger thing.
Absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk with you for a minute about motherhood. It's Mother's Day on Sunday. Happy Mother's Day to all the women in the audience.
Yay,
and
happy
to
Mother's
you
Day.
As well.
Thank you.
There are a lot of women in the audience who want to run for office. They're mothers of young children. Senator Shaheen talked about her experience being the mom of the young children being asked to run. My question to you is, how has being a mother of 3 yourself shaped how you think about philanthropy?
So I think in the most basic sense, it is it's the reason why we became philanthropists. We not to get too sort of psychoanalytical, but we initially, as you mentioned, we arrived at our financial position relatively early in our life. Everything was happening at the same time, so we were super young and then, had all these resources and then had babies. And so we were forced to sort of think about all these things at the same time. And one of the things that was very clear to us from the outset is that we don't believe in dynastic wealth. We don't believe that is we don't believe that's a policy answer. We don't believe that, just from a values perspective, we don't believe that that dynasties are a good thing. We don't believe that it's helpful for our children. In fact, we especially now that we've become more experienced and have seen more of the world and of our at least sort of economic peers, there are more examples of money destroying families than there are examples of money helping families. So it was very clear to us that we wanted to create something much bigger, and that the biggest gift that we could give our children was not our resources, but a better country. So from that perspective, it colored everything that we did from the beginning. And I think from a perspective of our issue areas, it's always about creating a better society. It's about creating more sustainable solutions. And I think all of us want to leave this country better for our children. You talked, the previous panel talked heavily about the debt discussions. That's a small example of a way that we have to look out for our future generations. Climate is another example. All of democracy. I mean, we have to create healthy systems so that this country can grow. So we always look at everything from the lens of, are we leaving the country in a better position than for our children and for everyone's children?
I think that this is a really interesting perspective around not wanting to leave a dynasty. And that's something that you've done in your philanthropy often. Something I really admire is your emphasis on giving in the present as opposed to creating endowments. And you've also urged changes in donor-advised funds to make sure that resources do get to the people who are making change in their communities faster. So what's your message to other philanthropists about how they should be thinking about making change in society?
Well, I wouldn't presume to give advice to other philanthropists as to what to do with their money. Philanthropy is a very personal journey. On the charitable gift, what you're referring to was our effort to pass legislation to close some of these charitable gift loopholes, especially, not to dwell into too many of the details, but there are about $1 trillion currently sitting in charitable gift funds in this country. $1 trillion. So people have gotten a tax deduction for giving to a charity, and that money is sitting in a charitable gift fund, which is essentially a bank account, helping no one, with the promise that at some point in the future, that money will help someone later. But people got the charitable gift deduction today. So that doesn't seem to be consistent with the goal of the program. So the effort around charitable gift reform is to create some parameters to close this loophole, so the charitable gift funds actually can give the money to working charities earlier and not have the money parked there and have people say that they gave a charitable deduction. So, but in terms of giving today versus giving later, we certainly are of the view that today's philanthropists and today's society should solve today's problems. That is not the view of everyone. I think there are some philanthropists who really want to be a resource for time immemorial, and they derive a lot of comfort and a lot of, I think, benefit from creating an institution that they know will be there for their community forever. I think that's a wonderful model. It happens to not be our model. I mean, we believe that the more distance there is between donor intent and the donations, the harder it is to stay loyal to donor intent. And you've seen this. There are many, many examples as organizations, as if donors die and the organization moves forward. There's just a lot of institutional creep. There's a lot of mission creep. People are much more risk averse because donors aren't because they don't have living donors, and so the organization becomes much more institutional and bureaucratic, and the values of the organization change because they no longer reflect donor intent. So our view is that we want to create change while we're living, and hopefully we'll live a long time. We're working on that. We do yoga and whatever. We work eat right, the whole thing. But so the plan is to live for a long time and to make these changes while we're living.
We're about to wrap up here, I see. But my concluding question to you is, you and your team at Arnold Ventures, you're taking on some of the nation's toughest issues at a time when we are highly polarized. So my last question to you is, what gives you hope?
So I don't believe we're polarized. I believe our systems are polarized. I believe our legislature, especially our federal legislature, is incentivized to remain polarized, and that's a problem. But I see we work nationwide, from Alaska to Florida to everything in between, and there's a lot of opportunity in states. There are people want to create a better tomorrow. People want to move on a lot of the issues that that are near and dear to us, from public finance and criminal justice to healthcare, journalism. All of the issues that are pressing in our lifetimes are happening in the states, and there's a whole lot of opportunity to do great things, because the closer you are to communities, the more you see the desire. So that gives me hope. I think that there's a lot of work to do, but we've got the most incredible team working nationwide on the most important issues to us, and I have great faith that we'll move the needle in ways that will make everyone proud.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both so much for that impactful conversation and an optimistic turn about how individuals can make a big difference on issues and come together in such partisan times. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker for some reflections on what we've heard today. Holly Harris is the founder and president of the network, where she oversees all operations, activities, and personnel at the organization. There she focuses on fostering these kinds of bipartisan conversations and cooperation on evidence-based solutions. Prior to funding the network, for those of you who don't know her, she was president and executive director of the Justice Action Network, the country's largest bipartisan criminal justice reform organization, where she was a driving force behind the passage of the First Step Act, a landmark criminal justice reform bill signed into law by President Barack Obama in 2018. Holly, the floor is yours.
I don't need, hello, can you hear me? I don't need this. I am about to reflect. Good morning. I love these events. I love getting my women friends and my men out there. Holla, men. I love getting my friends together to network and think about ways that we can work together. I'll give you an example. I was backstage with Laura Arnold and Joni Ernst, and Joni invited her to the Roast and Ride. Y'all know what that is? I thought to myself, if I can get Laura Arnold to go to Iowa with Joni Ernst and roast a pig and ride a motorcycle, I am done. That's it. I have reached the top. So it's super fun. As Anna mentioned, again, my name is Holly Harris. I am founder and president of the network. It's a brand new organization supporting advocates and lawmakers who are willing to work across the aisle on America's greatest challenges. I FaceTimed my 11-year-old little boy this morning, and I needed a little pick-me-up, so I was like, how do I look? He said, you look like you're going to the prom. I swear he is the only man in America that can make me feel insecure, the only one. But when you start a new organization, you're 46 years old, single mom, it's nerve-wracking. And so I'm so grateful to all of you all for being here for our very first collaboration with Punchbowl. Anna, Lee, Morgan, your entire team. I mean, if you are into doing events, do it with these women. They are fantastic. So thank you. And she knows I wouldn't say it if it wasn't true, you know what I'm saying? Thank you so much to our team at the network, Carrie, Cortland, Sam, John, you all are amazing. So grateful to Laura Arnold and all the women at Arnold Ventures. Without you all, none of this work would be possible, so thank you. So we have a lot of powerful people in this room. I don't know if y'all know that. We are very powerful, right? Ana Zamora here in the front row, leader of Just Trust, who coined the term recently, badassery, right? I think she was referring to Kevin Ring, one of the men here supporting the women challenging Washington. I see you, Kevin, in your pink tie. Yeah, and we've got the vice presidents of Arnold Ventures, my former colleagues at Justice Action Network. Since I have all of you all together, I'm going to reflect on an unfortunate refrain that I'm hearing a lot lately, all across every advocacy space. And it is, we're just not going to be able to get anything done this year. Those are the most disgusting words in the English language to me, because they're not true. So on March 27th, a lot of us in this room were traveling down to Nashville, Tennessee, and we heard on the radio that there had been a horrific shooting at a school in Nashville. It was the Covenant School. An individual entered this elementary school, shot and killed 6 people, including 3 adult educators and 3 young children. One of those children was Evelyn Dickhouse, 9-year-old Evelyn Dickhouse. Her mother, Katie, is here with us today. Her courage, her bravery. Katie joined, literally linked arms with her women friends, and linked arms from the Vanderbilt Medical Center, okay, all the way to the state capitol, and demanded change. And shortly thereafter, that's right. And shortly thereafter, they got the Republican governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee, to sign an executive order closing loopholes on background checks and urging common sense gun reform to protect our kids. And he's called a special session so the women of the Voices for a Safer Tennessee can make their case for why we need to protect our kids against gun violence. It's unbelievable to me what you all have been able to accomplish. Laura Arnold always says, don't jump on a moving train, be the train. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the mightiest train in America, the women of the Voices for a Safer Tennessee. Please stand and be recognized. That's how it's done. That's how it's done. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our next panel. I know these 3 women very well, 3 of my favorite women members of Congress, period. The first is Representative Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey. It's when we clap. Where's Tim Hannigan? I know Tim Hannigan's supposed to be leading the charge. I see you back there. So Mikey Sherrill is a former Navy helicopter pilot, former federal prosecutor. Again, one of the most powerful women in Congress, very quietly powerful, and I hear reporters on the front row, she might be a U.S. Senator someday, that's all I'm saying. Write that down. Our next guest is Representative Stephanie Bice from Oklahoma. That's when we clap. Representative Bice helped to build her family's tech company in Oklahoma, and she's also the first Iranian American to be elected to Congress, which is really exciting. And then our final member of Congress is Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester, one of my favorite women anywhere, one of the most dynamic speakers that you will ever meet. She is a former Secretary of Labor in Delaware and former Director of Personnel for the state. So we have 3 really, really talented women who are going to be interviewed by the great Heather Cagle of Punchbowl News. So please welcome Heather and 3 of the most dynamic women in the United States Congress.
Hello, hello. So Congresswoman Sherrill will be joining us shortly, But in the meantime, we have a lot to talk about today. It's a pretty big day, so let's just jump in. We'll start with the news of the day. As you guys know, President Biden is hosting the 4 congressional leaders at the White House this afternoon. We're potentially 3 weeks away from a default. Congresswoman Bice, I want to start with you. Would you be open to a short-term deal to give everyone more time to negotiate? And if so, would House Republicans need some kind of concessions for that?
You know, I think that hasn't been really a topic of conversation on the Republican House side right now. We put a deal together, we sent it to the Senate, and I think that that's really the starting point for Republicans. You know, you're right. We're on the cusp of you know, hitting that default deadline based on the information that Secretary Yellen's provided, and so we really do need the President and the Senate to come together and try to work on a solution, because I think the markets are beginning to get a little anxious about what's happening, and a resolution needs to come quickly.
Congresswoman Blunt-Rochester, Democrats, starting with Biden on down, have insisted they'll talk about spending cuts, but first we need a clean debt limit increase. You know, we're not going to pair the two together. Do you think, just given the time constraints, that is becoming an untenable position?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. Thank you for this conversation. And I think that part of the whole point of this is that we're having a conversation. And so I want to start out by saying, you know, for me, I came to Congress in 2016. I've been here, and under the Trump administration, all 3 times we passed a clean debt limit because we understood in a bipartisan way that this is about the full faith and credit of our country, and that we pay our bills. And so I think starting from that premise, I do believe this should be something that is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. This is really about our country. And so that's the number 1 premise. Number 2, I do think that, you know, when I think back, the president invited the speaker in, they had a conversation. The goal was for the speaker to come back with a proposal. The speaker has come back with his proposal. And as, you know, Stephanie said, there has to be this conversation that will happen today, that will take place today. But I really want us to be clear that we will have conversations about the budget. We do it every year that I've been here. And so that will happen. But today we're going to see what takes place. I'm hopeful, because I think all of us recognize that this really is about our country. We don't want seniors, we don't want veterans, we don't want anybody to be fearful and concerned. And that's why folks like us came to Congress, was to get stuff done, bottom line.
Congresswoman Bice, I want to go back to this a little bit. Hi, Congresswoman Cheryl.
Hey, you made me.
We're talking debt limit. I will come to you next. Some members of your conference on the more conservative side have questioned whether a default would actually be catastrophic. You know, they say, oh, we can pay certain people first. Prioritization is what they call it. In your mind, how bad would it be if the country did default on its debt?
Look, we are already facing some challenging financial times, given interest rates at a 7% rate. We've seen a lot of increases in cost of goods. I think a default would be catastrophic, and certainly I think the premise that some of my more far-right colleagues would sort of argue is that we're on an unsustainable path, and they want to see something done now. And I recognize that there is some truth to that, but shutting down the government, in my opinion, is not the way to get that done. We have to come together, have some tough conversations. We've had a lot of spending over the last couple of years, and it's not a path forward that the country can sustain. So we've got to figure out, where can we pull back? You can't, I think, tell me that there isn't some, overspend in government that we can't try to find some savings on. So that's really going to be the focus over the next couple of weeks.
Congresswoman Cheryl, thank you for joining us. I want to ask, some moderate Democrats have criticized President Biden for not meeting with McCarthy more than just at the beginning of February. Here we are a few weeks out from default, saying maybe it's time for our party to change our negotiating stance. Where do you fall on this? What do you think?
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone. I apologize. I just got off the Amtrak and took the back tunnels here that I didn't even know existed. So it's wonderful to be here with you this morning. Yeah, I come from northern New Jersey, sort of the economic and financial heart of the country. And as you can imagine, I hear about, discuss, and am focused on the debt ceiling every day. In fact, I just had a happy hour with some of my union members who really did not come to hear me about the debt default, but I had just been talking about it and gave them a huge, possibly unwanted lecture on the dangers of debt default and all the ways it would be catastrophic. But I think we're looking right now at making sure we come together. I'm very glad the meeting is happening today so we can work out a plan. And I think we'll find a lot of common ground on lifting the debt ceiling and looking at how we want to, where we want to focus on spending and where we want to focus on making sure we rein in some of the spending. I guess my concern is just, I would love to see this, I would love to see the debt not held hostage like this. Even the discussions sometimes shake the markets. And right now, as Stephanie said, when we're facing things like, trying to get inflation under control, when we see our foreign adversaries trying to undermine the US dollar, even with petroleum purchases, to sort of do what I consider self-harm in talking about, not paying our debts just seems to be a bad place to be right now. But I think we're all in agreement that we need to lift the debt ceiling, and then there are things we need to talk about of how we're going to handle spending going forward.
I want to talk a little bit about immigration. Title 42 ends on Thursday. We could see a huge influx of migrants coming to the border. Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, you are one of Biden's co-chairs for this campaign. Do you think the administration is prepared to handle this influx, and what kind of impact do you think it could have on the election?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to add a little bit to that last question too. In addition to looking at spending, we also have to look at revenue. Let's have a real deep conversation as we move forward. On the question of Title 42, one of the things that is very clear, I remember right before the president decided to run the first time, I was headed to the Northern Triangle, and he wrote me a letter, and he talked about why it was so important that we do things in the right way, in the humane way, and also respecting the situations of people coming from different places around the world. And this current situation is one I think all of us can agree is the result of us not coming together and having comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, this is a discussion that has been bipartisan in the past. I remember even meeting with members of my class in my freshman year. We were able, one of my jobs I felt was to pull us together for things like March Madness, even though I didn't care about basketball, or I would pull us together. We did a night at the Holocaust. We did. Well, hey, I'm from Fairleigh Dickinson. We busted everybody's bracket the last time.
That's my district.
Just saying. But part of it was to bring folks together. And one night we closed down the Holocaust Museum. They let us tour it. And then Democrats and Republicans sat in a room together with nobody there, no constituents, no media, just us. And we talked about the need for immigration reform from different perspectives. I think this moment points to that. I think Title 42 also points to the fact that the administration is following the science. We have to follow the science. And so their plan to make sure that we have these centers in places where folks can go in their own countries or in Mexico and other countries before they get here is one that I think makes sense. I think that they're doing the things that need to be put in place. But ultimately, I think we have a job to do. We as Congress have a job to do, and we need to be doing it in a bipartisan way. That's where I land. It's our job.
Congresswoman Vice, there's the House Republican bill this week. Is that something, the immigration package? No Democrats are expected to support it, but is that something that you plan to vote for?
Absolutely. We have a crisis at the southern border. And the context that I give when I'm back home talking to constituents is we've had more illegal crossings in the United States than the number of citizens of the state of Oklahoma. That's a huge, huge number. And look, I'm the daughter of an immigrant. It was mentioned earlier that I'm the first Iranian American ever elected to Congress. My father would actually argue that point. He says, I'm the Iranian American, you're the American. Given that I've never been and I don't speak Farsi, but I think the point is that I recognize why people want to come to this country, but it is a disservice to people like my father and many others who have come here the legal pathway to provide a path that individuals may be pursuing that is not the same. Look, I do agree with Lisa. We have to find a way to address the immigration issue. We have a workforce shortage in the country. There could be a significant impact on workforce should we allow for more seasonal visas, a faster processing of those. But we have to address the border issue first before we can really have a conversation about some of these other things. And I'm hopeful that we'll see some movement on that in the next few days.
And Congresswoman Sherrill, last question on this to you before we pivot to the topic of the day. This was a huge issue for Republicans in the last election. They'll probably try to make border security a huge issue again. What do you hear when you go back home? Is this something your constituents come to you on? And do you feel pressure to kind of vote with Republicans on some of these bills?
It's so interesting because I hear sort of the length and the breadth of what you might expect. I have a large undocumented population, as I think most people do in my district. One of the Spanish language churches, a large kind of mega church, the reverend there is often encouraging people, pay your taxes, make sure that you are ready should there be a change in the law and you're being a good proto-citizen or someone who could become a citizen of this country. I hear people saying, no immigration whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I would say that the majority of people, because right now we have we have a real growth in our economy based in many ways on some of the legislation. So we passed legislation in the last Congress, which has led to a huge increase in the manufacturing sector in my district. We've seen numbers in employment like we haven't seen since the early 90s. But that with it, we are facing a little bit of a job crisis, finding the people to employ. So there is a real sense, I think, in my district of sort of what Congress needs to do, which is comprehensive immigration reform. People are concerned about security at the border. They're concerned about fentanyl. They're concerned about who's coming across the border in New Jersey. I don't think people in my district have the same sense that maybe Stephanie does of the numbers coming across and the burden that puts on our southern states. Mm-hmm. We're a little removed from that. However, I think there's a real desire to have a better plan at the border. But there also is a real desire to fix our immigration system so that we have enough of the labor force that we need in New Jersey to grow our economy.
I have to say jobs too, because I was a former Secretary of Labor, and we know that we are seeing these shortages, but we also have demographic shifts in our own population.
Right.
I mean, we're aging, we have less young people, we need people of all different backgrounds. So,
and I think we saw a disengagement of the over 60 population when COVID hit, right?
That's right.
That was a pretty significant segment of the workforce that decided to disengage, and I think we've seen the effects of that over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I would just add really quickly, if I could, the other
You can
thing
see
I
we
hear,
really are passionate about this.
I
appreciate that.
Yeah, I hear a lot. We have an interfaith community. We have a very large Jewish community. Asylum is really important in my district. A lot of our asylum laws were written in the wake of the United States not allowing Jewish people fleeing the Nazis to come into our country, and so that is really on the minds of a lot of members of my community as well.
And we don't want to forget the dreamers either. I mean, this really points to why we have to have
It's a very complex issue. It really is. I want to pivot to bipartisanship, women challenging Washington. As Holly said in her introduction, you all are trailblazers in your own right. First Iranian American in Congress, first woman from Delaware, Black American from Delaware, one of the first female Navy combat pilots, first Democrat to hold your district in a long time. You also all haven't been afraid to reach across the aisle and work with the other party on bills to try to get things done. So the first one I want to talk about is women's health care. Obviously, there's a huge insurmountable difference between Democrats and Republicans in a lot of ways over abortion access. But there are other areas where you guys have been able to find common ground, including fertility fraud. And Congresswoman Cheryl and Bice, who worked on this bill, Congresswoman Cheryl, I wanted to ask you, how did this come together? And for both of you, how did you find each other, and what are the prospects this Congress?
Well, I think, if you're around women in politics, you often hear, we have to have a seat at the table or we're on the menu. I mean, that's sort of like just, if you've heard it once, you've heard it a million times. And yet I'm not sure that people quite then take the next step to understand, what does that mean? What does it look like in Congress to have women in Congress? And I think Stephanie saw a documentary on this fertility fraud and was just so struck by it, because I think any woman could imagine to, the stories we were hearing, to be telling some of the most intimate parts of your life to a doctor and trusting that doctor to help you conceive in something that maybe you envision as what you want your family to be, and to have that trust in the doctor, and to have that doctor examine you in a very vulnerable way, and then to leave the room and use his own sperm. I mean, really, it just like makes you physically ill.
And Mikey, can I add, and I think the most egregious part of this whole thing is the fact that in most states there's no laws protecting the women.
No laws protecting the women. And
You
in
can't,
many
there's
of
no
these
civil
areas,
or criminal laws.
multiple times, multiple children, not knowing that they could be related. One woman told the story of, I think, being in a break room at work and somehow tracing that they were related. And they hadn't had a romantic relationship, but you just see like how easily that could have occurred. It just is horrible on many levels, and Stephanie saw that, and I think viscerally felt that, and came to me saying, would this be something you would, and she had me at, fertility fraud. Like, yes. I think just because as, somebody who's basically as someone who's been to a gynecologist, right? That's basically all you need to know to understand how traumatic this would be for a woman. And so we were able to come together, and Stephanie really led this, I think, in a wonderful way, and brought a lot of women together to really to promote this piece of legislation. And I was really glad you came and asked me to be on it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I watched the documentary Our Father, who highlighted one of the siblings who figured out through commercially available DNA testing that she was one of dozens at the time of children that were fathered by a physician, a reproductive physician out of Indiana, and now there's over 90 siblings. And I think for me, what really made me just angry to my core was the fact that there was no repercussions for the families. Most states don't have any sort of laws that protect them. And so I immediately started texting my staff, we have to do something about this. And my staff's like, what are you talking about? And the next day I sort of explained it to them, and then I kept telling everyone, you have to watch this documentary. It will shock you to your core. And it did. And many of my colleagues have seen it and recognize what an egregious situation this was, not only for the woman, but for the family. As a child, you think that you know your father, your biological father, and then you take a DNA test and you find out that the man that raised you is not biologically related to you. It's a deep pain for a lot of these families that you can never imagine. And so this is not a partisan issue, and there are a lot of issues in Washington that certainly are. We talked about some of them earlier, but there are also a lot of things that are not partisan, and I think this is one of those that we feel good about getting across the finish line.
Yeah, I had never heard of this issue, frankly, until we started prepping for this panel. And like you, I was horrified. Congresswoman Rochester, I want to turn to you. Another issue that we've seen some agreement to varying levels from, especially from female lawmakers, is contraception access. You all have co-sponsored different bills, but related to that issue. You in particular spoke out about how lack of reproductive care really affects younger women, lower income women, Black women. What would you like to see happen this Congress? What do you think is possible with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate?
Well, what's possible and what I'd like to see are probably two different things. But, you know, I do feel, I think about my daughter. I think about why it's so important for this representation to be here. I remember sitting in a committee hearing. I'm on the health subcommittee. And I remember one of my male colleagues making the point that why are we having this discussion about the Hyde Amendment? We haven't had this discussion for 40 years or something like that. And I said, you know, I said to Lizzie Fletcher, and she said it out loud, there weren't that many women here 40 years ago. So our voices matter. And that's why this representation matters. For me, I'd love to see Roe codified. You know, it's, yes. I mean, it's like that foundational. You know, it's been there since I was 10 years old. And so I'd like to see that. I'd like to see us not roll back the efforts of the FDA, their work. And if it starts here, where does it go from there? Those are the things I'd like to see. I personally have worked on making sure that there are opportunities for young people to have mentors, because also this is about pregnancy prevention if it's not time or you don't want it. Another issue that my staff are probably going to be like, what? But someone raised to me recently that we talk a lot. I have a bill, the Moms Matter Act, which is about you know, dealing with our issues of our maternal mortality challenges and making sure that we have access to, you know, both substance use and mental health services. But what we don't talk about, we talk a lot about maybe women bearing children. We don't talk about menopause. Some of us may choose to have children, but many of us, most of us, are going to go through the change. And how much research is there out there on that in that area? And so for me, I'd like my daughter, and just almost 3 months ago, I had my first granddaughter, my first grandchild, Lennox. And it is everything they say. It is everything they say. She is pure joy. But I would love for her to have the same freedoms, reproductive freedoms that I had as well. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. Yeah.
Congresswoman Bice, you have co-sponsored a contraception access bill. Can you talk a little bit about where Republicans could meet Democrats on this issue?
Sure. Last Congress, there was legislation filed that sort of protected contraception. And Lisa's the mother of a daughter. I have two daughters that are actually in college. And so I recognize the importance of this issue. And unfortunately, with the legislation filed in the 117th Congress, there was a piece of that allowed for the chemical abortion pill to be covered. And that was, I think, a sticking point for Republicans. We had to say, look, you know, that's not something we can be in favor of, but everything else is absolutely something we wanted to protect. Because there was no willingness to negotiate on the other side, I filed the exact same bill without that particular piece in there, because I wanted my constituents back home and really, you know, women across the country to recognize Republicans have very similar ideas on the contraception piece of this. It's important, but there were some nuances that needed to be addressed. And so, you know, I think we can find some common ground in some of those areas. It's just maybe not going as far as some would like.
Well, we're quickly running out of time, but I want to touch on a couple of things very quickly, including an issue that has impacted probably a lot of us in this room, including on this stage at some point, access to childcare. Congresswoman Sherrill, you You're a mother of 4. How have you seen this issue evolve since being elected to Congress? And do you think that other lawmakers, particularly male lawmakers, really understand the importance of Congress addressing this?
Getting childcare in this country has gotten worse and worse and worse related to COVID in many cases, although it started, I had to find childcare for my oldest daughter 17 years ago. It was horrific. It's gotten worse now. Many of my male colleagues have no concept of what that's like or what that means. And especially my older male colleagues, I think some of my younger ones have dealt with some childcare issues. But see my last answer. If you're not at the table, you're not on the menu. This is what it looks like. Because I think there's a complete misunderstanding. So the piece of legislation that I have would say that nobody in this country pays more than 7% of their income in child care. A piece of legislation that is out there that I have had some disagreements with my male colleagues over is a piece of legislation that's focused on lower income women. I think we should start there. I think that's a really important focus, but this isn't simply about lower income women. When we look across the job spectrum at who didn't go to work during COVID, who had a hard time returning to work after COVID, it's women. It's women across the economic spectrum. And it's related to childcare because it's been awful. I would speak to, because I had a hard enough time with my children during COVID. I remember one particularly troubling Zoom where my young daughter is doing cartwheels behind me. I didn't quite realize it because I wasn't focused. And goes, "Oh, it's so nice to see other people's children." I said, "Yeah, it's really nice to see other people's children. I don't want to see my kids on my Zoom as I'm trying to be professional." It was really, I'd speak to friends with young children. I say, "How are you doing?" "Oh, it's hard. I wake up and I get some work done before the baby gets up, and then I feed him, and then they go down for a nap, and I get a little more work done, and then I, have this." And I don't think they slept. I don't think, anyone was sleeping. I'm like, when, and then the baby goes to bed, and then they work into the night to finish it. It was horrible. And so, the reason that it's important that no one pays 7%, and this is the fight I got into with a colleague of mine, was this sort of sense that, hey, if your husband's making a lot of money, why do you care, right? Like, what's it to you? My frustration was like, how many marriages end in divorce? What if your husband passes away? What if your husband loses his job? The reason society likes marriage is because it's a redundancy in the system. So we want to make sure that women who want to work, parents who want to work, have that opportunity to do that, not based on whether or not your spouse has a good job or if they can work or what they're, you are a human, independent person that should have the same opportunities. So I've been fighting really hard with legislation to address this. And I think it is an area of a lot of bipartisan understanding, whether or not that piece of legislation will become bipartisan. But I think this understanding that we need to address childcare is a very bipartisan understanding, especially for women on both sides of the aisle who've had children, because it's really a huge struggle. So I think there is growing support to address this. I think given the need for more people in the job market, given what women returning to the job market has been looking like, and also I think as you understand what a boon to the economy this would be and how far we've fallen behind. 20 years ago, we were first among developed countries in women in the workforce, and we have fallen behind significantly over the last 2 decades. So this is one of the ways we can, I think, really make an impact.
Mm-hmm. I have a fun question to wrap this up, but first, I would be remiss if I did not ask you. You are the leading front runner for the Delaware Senate seat if one were to open up, just if. Do you plan on running?
Oh, we're going that bold. Well, first of all, I love being in Congress. I love serving Delaware. Currently, I'm at large, So I currently run statewide, which is probably why I believe in working in such a bipartisan way. Should the opportunity present itself, I'm interested.
Thank you, thank you. Well, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask one more question for all of the young women, the women in the audience. I'll start with you, Congresswoman Bice. What is one piece of advice you would give your younger self that you want them to take out of this room with them?
For me, that's easy, and that's say yes. You know, I never imagined in my wildest dreams that I would run for public office. This was not in my life plan. I was a married mom of two, running my own small business, living the American dream. And in 2014, a gentleman that I had gotten to know well was in the state Senate, and he called me one day and he said, "I'm not running for re-election, and you should run for my state Senate seat." And my response was, "Why?" And he said, "Because I've seen the things you've done in the community. I've seen the things that you've done in some of the professional circles that we serve in, and you're a doer. You are the type of person that wants to get things done, and we need more women." And at the time in Oklahoma, there were 6 women out of 48 in the state Senate, 13 out of 101 in the House. We were 49th in the country for female legislators. And so for me, saying yes at that moment gave me the opportunity, to Mikey's comment, to have a seat at the table and to show my daughters, don't be afraid to do something big and bold and outside the box. Little did I know that 6 years later, I would be saying yes to a run for Congress. Be careful what you wish for, but truly, you know, sometimes God leads you on a path that you don't really recognize, you don't think about, and sometimes you just gotta have to take a leap of faith and say, yeah, I'm in.
Thank you. Good advice. Congresswoman Blunt Rochester?
My advice to my younger self would be, do it afraid. Do it even when you're scared. The saying yes requires the faith, but also to do it when you're afraid. I actually had never run for anything in my life before I ran for Congress. You talked about women being divorced. I had been divorced after a 20-year marriage and challenging raising teenagers. I then fell in love again. And then in 2014, my husband went on a business trip, ruptures his Achilles tendon, and blood clots went to his heart and lungs, and at 52, he passed away. And it shook me to the core. And I didn't know what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I remember that whole year just feeling like on autopilot in a daze. And I ran into, in the supermarket, a father and 3 kids in front of me who put back grapes because they were $9. And it snapped me out of my own situation, because I'm okay. I had a house, I had family. Charles left everything in order, but I knew there were a lot of other people who were struggling, including people in my city of Wilmington, where they were calling it murder town. And I decided, even though I had never run for anything, I had never been in a debate, I had never raised that kind of money, I'm gonna do it. And I did it. And I became the first woman, the first person of color to represent the first state. And I love being here at this moment. Do it, do it, do it afraid, even if you're scared. That's my advice. And I was afraid. I was a deer in the headlights, like it was like really afraid.
Yeah, you guys kind of stole my answers. I couldn't agree more, and I would just say also be open to the possibilities. There was one moment where I had a very vision. I had envisioned what my career would look like, and I wanted to do this job next, and somebody offered me this really great job, and I said, no, that's not my plan. And then a couple days later, I said, actually, that's a great job. And he's like, yeah, it is a great job. We hired someone. So, the next time, another opportunity came up that I was not in my plan, and I was like, I don't really want that job. But instead of saying no, I said, oh, that's really interesting. I'd like to learn more. I learned more, and I took the job, and it worked out really well. So I think kind of saying yes, being able to do things when you're afraid to do it or don't see the pathway, and then being open to those different opportunities that life offers to you. And I don't know what it is. I don't know why as women, our first instinct is, oh, I couldn't.
Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't. And I mean, you're talking to, 3 people up here. I think we've, taken some leaps and done some ambitious things. And yet, if I'm reading you guys right, and certainly I'll tell you when somebody first told me, you should run for Congress, I was like, oh, God, no. I have 4 kids, and I'm in Jersey. I'm not going down to D.C. The first instinct is, oh, I couldn't. So maybe the next generation, your first instinct could at least be, oh, maybe. Maybe we'll get to yes, but oh, yeah, let me think about it. So that's my advice.
We never make that sort of aggressive forward move, right?
Right.
We always have to be asked, and I think that's something I've learned, and I try to pass on to women, younger women, is don't wait for the opportunity to come to you, go after it.
And it is,
Make it happen.
I am a feminist to my core, and for whatever reason, we do that, and yet when I was running for Congress, there were a million young men who did not have the same trepidation.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but it was a great conversation, a lot of wisdom, and I'd like to welcome Anna Palmer back to the stage.
Let them get off stage real quick. And get to the next, I'm sure, meetings and hearings. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, what an amazing morning of conversations. I feel like as CEO and one of the founders of Punchbowl News, this panel really resonated at the end, the idea of saying yes, being afraid, and taking chances. And I hope that all of you learned a lot. I want to thank all of the members of Congress that joined us this morning, the senators, the members who were just here, their staffs who made it happen. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the live stream. If you do not subscribe to Punchbowl News, please do at punchbowl.news. We have some more refreshments, coffee, headshots that are going to happen. I hope you can take the opportunity to meet somebody new here, expand your network. Have a great day and stay safe. Thanks so much.